Good evening, everybody, and a big thank you to Tembi for the opportunity to speak on this topic of neurodiversity, which I have to admit I don't come to as any kind of an expert, but as a learner. And there may be folks on this platform who have a lot more experience in this area than I do, and I welcome your input later on. But let's get into this topic of neurodiversity. Let's start where we ought to start with the Bible. And the Bible says in Luke 14, go out quickly into the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in here the poor, the maimed, the lame, and the blind. And the servant said, Master, it is done as you commanded, and there is still room. One of Jesus' great concerns was to make sure that the marginalized in society had a seat at the table. And when we cater to the needs of neurodivergent people, we're doing just that. Now, the way that we understand disability greatly influences the way we treat people with disabilities. And historically, attitudes towards disability have shifted. And throughout history, there have been some terrible ways that disabled people have been viewed and disabled people have been treated. Now, the term neurodiversity was coined by Judy Singer in the 1990s, who herself was autistic. And her work represented part of the shift in attitudes in the area of disability generally and in the area of neurodivergence specifically. Now, she said the human species is neurodiverse. Individuals whose neurology differs substantially from dominant norms are neurodivergent. So the distinction between the two terms, neurodiversity embraces the whole of mankind. The term neurodivergent refers to those who, while everybody has a different character, different personality type, the vast majority of people, in terms of brain function, have enough similarities to place them in a category of being neurotypical. Those who fall outside of the norm in terms of the way people's brains function are neurodivergent. So, as I mentioned, there has been a shifting attitude throughout history. We can go back to times where disabled people were treated appallingly, and attitudes towards disability ranged from things like demon possession to some kind of affliction or some kind of a curse. But attitudes are changing. Steve Silberman said this in his book Neurotribes, that the word neurodiversity was coined at a time when autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and other cognitive variations were only defined as inferior and diseased. Dr. Thomas Armstrong, in his book Neurodiversity, said, neurodiversity includes an exploration of what have thus far been considered mental disorders of neurological origin, but that may instead represent alternative forms of natural human difference. So this shift in attitude is represented by different models of disability. I think there were three main ones that were identified. One was the charity model, which basically saw disability as something which afflicts certain members in our society, and they are deserving of pity, they're deserving of compassion, but disabled people were not viewed with any kind of potential in terms of contribution they could make to their communities. Then there was a shift to a more of a medical model. Now, the medical model is based largely on a deficit view of disability as a problem to be fixed. We have now shifted toward a more social model of disability, which views disability as a different way of functioning that must be embraced, accommodated, and even celebrated. So with the medical model, the, in quotes, impairment is the problem. And in the social model, the lack of acceptance is the problem. And so you can see a drastic shift there in terms of the way disability is viewed. Now, in our current climate, disability rights are viewed as a human right. The social justice movement, which gathered pace after the killing of George Floyd, has placed great emphasis on full inclusion of people with disabilities as a human right. So the civil rights movement, which began in the 60s, emphasized disability of part of that movement. And out of it came this phrase, nothing about us without us. And essentially what disabled people were saying was that we need a voice. We want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to be included. If you're making laws that affect us, then consult us. And that's a good principle that we need to take into account in the church context, that we need to hear the voices of neurodivergent people so that we can make whatever accommodations that we need to make in order to make the church a safe and accepting place for neurodivergence. So what is neurodiversity? Kind of alluded to it already, but some people exhibit differences in functions like social understanding, sensory perception, attention, communication, memory, and other cognitive functions. No brain is the same. So just like every one of us has a different set of fingerprints, we all have a different brain and different ways of functioning. But again, those who fall outside of the normal ways of operating, and that's for want of a better word, because normal is a problematic word in and of itself. But those whose brains function in a way that the vast majority of people don't function are classed as neurodivergent. It's a bit clumsy way of expressing it, but I think you get the idea. Audre Lorde said this: "It is not our differences that divide us, it is our inability to recognize difference, accept and celebrate those differences." It is not our differences that divide us, it is our inability to recognize, accept and celebrate those differences. I'll get my teeth in a moment. All right, so neurodiversity is not a disorder that comes and goes, but rather is lifelong and cannot be cured or fixed. It is what it is, and our responsibility as a church is to make the accommodations that recognizes people's uniqueness and individuality. Now, here are examples of different types of neurodivergence. Dyspraxia, which involves challenges with movement, coordination, practical tasks, balance, spatial awareness, muscle tone. Dyscalculia, which is difficulty with numbers and concepts, calculation. Dyslexia, which involves challenges with reading, writing, spelling, speaking, listening, language processing. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, where people may be easily distracted or overly focused in a particular area, may exhibit impulsivity, temper outbursts, hyperactivity, and demonstrate a low frustration threshold. Then there are those who experience autism spectrum disorder, and that involves social and communication problems, and again, obsessive interests in particular areas. Now, I've put a question mark in there because there is debate within the medical and psychological communities about other conditions that may or may not be considered neurodivergent. For example, obsessive compulsive disorder, or bipolar disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. And the argument against these being neurodivergence is that people are not born with these conditions, whereas with those that you see on the screen, people are born with them. But the other conditions I just mentioned are developed as a result maybe of trauma or other particular circumstances, and so there is a view that they don't constitute neurodivergence. So some possible early signs of neurodiversity that parents can look for or notice: difficulties in relating to others, hyperactivity or passivity, oversensitivity to sound, unusual behavior or body movements, regular spinning in circles, unusual attachment to objects, avoiding eye contact, difficulty adjusting to change, meticulous attention to detail, inappropriate laughing or crying, unusual or repetitive play, oversensitivity to smells, making up words or language, and aversion to messy play. Now, these may simply be indicators. Children may exhibit one or more of these characteristics, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they are neurodivergent. But if you are seeing these in a pronounced way, then it may be an indication that you need to get your child checked out. One of the things that has been noticed with neurodivergence is that there are often co-occurring conditions. It used to be called comorbidity, but the language is changing. I'll say more about that in a short while. But co-occurring conditions, for example, firstly, it's innate conditions. Now, an innate condition is one where it's something that you're born with. So an individual may have autism, but they may also have dyspraxia or dyslexia. Co-occurring simply means that there are two conditions that exist at the same time. The second example are resulting conditions. So an individual may have autism, but then develop anxiety as a result of trying to operate in a way that's not natural to who they are. And then there are associated conditions, and this causes some level of puzzlement. For example, there are statistics or research that shows that people who are autistic have a higher level of irritable bowel syndrome. Now, there is no logical reason as to why that may be, but it has been observed through research, and so that is an associated condition. Let's look briefly at autism spectrum disorder, specifically just some statistics from the government. Autistic people are 40% or 40 times more likely to die from epilepsy. 16 to 25% of children who died by suicide during the pandemic were autistic. Autistic youngsters are 3 to 6 times more likely to be gender diverse, to identify as either the opposite gender or to identify as gender neutral or non-binary, which is a very interesting statistic, bearing in mind current trends. Autistic people have one of the worst employment rates of any disabled group. They have a 16-year lower life expectancy. 1 in 10 people who die by suicide are autistic. So there is a very high level of mental health problems with autistic people. 1 in 5 of women or girls are in eating disorder services. So it is a challenge. More boys tend to be diagnosed with autism than girls. The statistics vary depending on which organization you listen to. They range from 1 in 2 to 1 in 16, but the most recent research indicates about 1 in 3 boys to every 1 girl is diagnosed with autism. And the 79% of autistic people experience mental health problems. So we see the challenges, and these challenges impact individuals who are part of the faith community. So some of the factors impacting mental health: the struggle to try to fit into or make sense of the world, which can lead to feelings of depression and anxiety. Can you imagine that if an individual is autistic and they feel pressured to operate in what is considered normal, then that can take a lot of effort, mental effort, to try to appear in a way that the individual believes that will make them acceptable. And that can give rise to anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. The attempts to fix or normalize autistic people are extremely debilitating for them. So if they are who they are, and yet people are trying to change them, that can be very debilitating. Delays in mental health diagnosis. They are more likely to face stigma and discrimination, and they're less likely to have appropriate support available. There is a lack of specialist counselors for those who are neurodivergent. I like this quote: "The problem with trying to knock a square peg into a round hole is that you damage the peg in the process." So we have to be careful how we relate to people who exhibit neurodivergence, because we can, in our sincere attempts to help, we can cause more problems than we solve. Now, one of the largest ongoing debates within disability ministries is the use of language. This is within the disability field in general. For example, the concept of high or low functioning. So many neurodivergent people remain dependent on carers for survival and support during adulthood, while others are often able to live and to work and maintain social relationships independently. Now, forgive me, that the image you see on screen, where you see black, that should be green. Just a technical problem. My software is turning green into black. So just use your imagination and see green. Similarly here. So on the top, what you have is a very linear view of how autistic people or neurodivergent people function. More accurate is the second image, where there is more of a circular spectrum. So an individual may function in what appears to be a neurotypical way in some areas, and in other areas they may function in what is considered neurodivergent. So again, in terms of language, the shift of language, for example, autistic spectrum disorder is the more preferred term is autistic neurotype. We need to move away from talking in terms of cures and look at specific support services. Comorbidity, I mentioned before, is the preferred term is co-occurring. The idea of functioning, we should get away from, again, the high functioning, low functioning idea, and again, look at support needs and strengths. Normal is a no-no word, because what is normal? As we said before, everybody is different. Preferred term is neurotypical. Get away from describing people who have disabilities as suffering from their disability. I mean, suffering can be involved, but um, in terms of the language, better to simply identify what a disability is. A person is neurodivergent. Um, get away from focus on symptoms and deficits and look more in terms of traits of characteristics. Um, the term nonverbal and non-speaking. And when I saw this, I had to consult with my wife. She's a specialist in the area of autism, and so I needed some clarification because it seems like the same thing to me. And what she explained was that just because a person is not speaking doesn't mean that they don't have language. I remember watching a documentary about disabled people, and there was a young man who he was non-speaking, and people kind of dismissed him. Um, didn't think he had anything to offer. But then, when technology was developed, which allowed him to be able to articulate his thoughts on a screen, people were absolutely amazed at his ability to construct complex sentences and highly intelligent individual, unable to speak and non-speaking, but he had language. The Bible says in Leviticus 19, verse 14, do not insult the deaf or cause the blind to stumble. You must fear your God. I am the Lord. So the principle there is let's treat people with respect and use language in order to communicate that respect. Jim Sinclair in the 1990s was another pioneer in the field of neurodiversity. And he said it is not possible to separate the person from autism. There has long been a debate about how to describe people with disabilities. Should we talk about a person with autism or an autistic person? Is it, is it disability first or person first? Well, one argument says that disability does not define me, therefore I should be identified as a person with autism. The second view says my autism is a part of my identity, and to separate me from my disability is to deny my identity. So really here, who is to say which is right? The best course of action is to describe people in the way that they best like to be described. I think that's a safe way to go. What the research indicates is that most autistic people prefer to be described as an autistic person. So, general principles in communicating with or talking about people with disabilities. If in doubt, use person first language. Bear in mind that disabled is a description, not a group of people. Don't patronize or talk down. Assume competence. You will invariably get it wrong. Just apologize and move on. It's quite possible that even during this presentation, I have used language that is not the best language to use. I'm open to learn. So when we do make mistakes, just own it and move on. Challenge other people's attitudes, bullying, name calling, and jokes. Even within the church context, if you hear people speaking about people with disabilities in a derogatory way, or a way that is simply ignorant, challenge that, Or we don't have to do that in a confrontational way, but challenge it. Don't assume someone's relationship with their disability. A general example is that there was a conversation with two people. One used a wheelchair, and the person who was speaking with them said that described them as being confined to their wheelchair, whereas the wheelchair user, said that they are not confined to their wheelchair, they are liberated by their wheelchair. approach here. So don't assume people's relationship with their disability. Ask if somebody needs or doesn't need support. Don't just assume and jump in. Reflect someone's own language choices, as long as it doesn't conflict with your own set of values. And I'll say no more about that. Avoid medical labels which reinforce stereotypes. Communicate directly to a person with a disability. So in terms of this idea of normal, there is a new normal, as it were. We spoke about the shift in attitudes when it comes to disability. So we must revisit our deeply cultural assumptions about what it means to be normal. Harvey Bloom said this, he's an author. He said, neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will be best at any given moment? So we need to broaden our perspective. It is crucial that we avoid making judgmental assumptions about neurodivergent people and those who support them. I love this quote from Dr. Stephen Shaw. He said, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. The same way that we would not paint people of a particular ethnicity with one brush, we should not paint people with autism with one brush. We need to see people as individuals and treat them as such. Organizations like NASA have recognized that neurodivergent people often possess the skill sets that make them invaluable employees. So NASA has a neurodiversity network which taps into some of the skill sets that neurodivergent people have. And this is a good lesson for us within the church. But again, moving away from the deficit view of disability, we should be looking to see how we can tap into the skill sets, the abilities that neurodivergent people may possess. So this represents a paradigm shift. This is a term that was coined by Stephen Covey of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People fame. The neurodiverse paradigm seeks to maximize strengths rather than focus on perceived weaknesses. Now, the church has been accused historically of ableism. Ableism is simply discrimination against people with disabilities. And oftentimes, this is not about malice, but more so about a lack of awareness. Nancy Iceland said this, for many disabled persons, the church has been a city on a hill, physically inaccessible and socially inhospitable. So the church is often complicit in neglecting to engage with the social model of disability, and that results in ableism. So ableism is mainly about systems and structures that marginalize people with disabilities. If we think about how we operate within the church, it is very simple. It's very easy to neglect the needs of neurodiverse people or neurodivergent people. So they tend to operate in churches that are often not organized with them in mind. So, for example, timekeeping. Neurodivergent people tend to like set structures. So if you have a service that says it starts at 10 o'clock and finishes at 12:30, then stick to your timings. When services drag on, that can cause a lot of stress to people who operate according to a structure. Things like lighting and noise levels can be upsetting for neurodivergent people. Greeting. Some people have a real problem with touch. And so, while it is nice to have people in church who are enthusiastic greeters, who will greet with a hug, some people are not comfortable with that. Images, what we portray on a screen, and I guess you're kind of struggling to read what's on there. It's nothing significant. Simply to illustrate the point that the images that we put up on screen, if there is, for example, too much words on a PowerPoint, that can be upsetting for a person who struggles with reading. So this is about just being considerate, and emphasizes again the point that I made earlier about consulting with neurodivergent people to recognize what the needs are. If we just go ahead and plan without them in mind, then more often than not, we will do things that may adversely impact them. Matthew 13:20-21. As for what was sown on rocky ground, such a person has no root. When trouble or persecution arises, that person immediately falls away. Now, we quote this passage usually in terms of apostasy. But it was one book that I was reading, and I can't even recall who wrote it at the moment, but it expressed the idea that when we have people in church who are neurodivergent who have disabilities, and we don't create an accepting environment for them, they can leave the church. Why? Because they have not taken root. They have not been made to feel accepted and have not developed a sense of belonging. So families who are affected by disability often intentionally avoid the faith community because of a lack of support to help them take root, and that's a sad state of affairs. Research done by the group Understood shows that in terms of church attendance, 19% of people with ADHD do not attend church. Those who are affected by learning disabilities, the number is 36%. Those who struggle with anxiety, 45%. And remember, we spoke about co-occurring. So a person who is neurodivergent may develop anxiety because they're trying to function in a particular environment. Those who have conduct disorders, 55% will not attend church because they feel they don't want to be embarrassed and they don't want to cause disruption, so their families might just stay away. With autism, the figure is 84% of people who are autistic within the faith community will avoid going to church, and that's sad. So again, Understood, their research states that families of children with disabilities often feel excluded from faith communities, and children with behavioral or social issues are less likely to attend religious services than other children. So again, the point about how we organize church. Do we have people with disabilities helping to decide how we shape what the church should look like and how it should function? If we don't hear the voices of neurodivergent people and people with disabilities in general, then how can we accommodate their needs? So we really need to be intentional when we sit on our committees, in our youth committees, in our church boards, in our building projects. We need to be hearing the voices of neurodivergent people so that we can make the appropriate accommodations. James 2 and verse 1 says, "My brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality." And again, this is not necessarily about being malicious, but if we operate in a particular way that does not take into consideration a significant percentage, a significant portion of our community, then we are being partial. So, the lost sheep. parable of the lost sheep. And how did the shepherd know that one of his sheep was lost? Well, he counted. He counted. An inclusive ministry with our churches must begin with a crucial question: who is missing? And when we answer that question, we find our mission. Let me get my head out of the way. States that 1 in 7 people in the UK are neurodivergent. Now, if that's the case, how is that reflected within the church? 1 in 7 is a significant figure. And it's quite possible that we have a significant number of individuals sitting in our pews who are neurodivergent. And the question is, are we catering to their needs? Better education can help us avoid making assumptions and judgments about other people that can negatively impact our relationships and the health of the church community. Here is Lamar Hardwick, who is otherwise known as the Autistic Pastor, and he's written an excellent book, Disability and the Church. And he was diagnosed with autism in his early 40s. I think it was 42 when he was diagnosed. Up until that time, there were congregations that he served that considered him to be aloof and distant and even rude at times. But he was completely oblivious because he was just who he was. He wasn't trying to be rude, but because he had struggles picking up on social cues and the general way that people operate, he came across in a way that didn't communicate who he really was. And I know, in my own experience, I know of a person in ministry who was diagnosed very late in life with Asperger's syndrome. And similar situation to Lamar Hardwick. They were considered to be rude and aloof, just weren't aware that they were neurodivergent. Excuse me. So, if you build it, they will come. When the church creates the right soil or environment, families who have historically avoided the church can find a place to belong and be active in the development of their faith and the use of their gifts. So, going back to what I was saying about people not attending church, research indicates that some people who are neurodivergent will avoid going to church until the sermon time, and then they will leave immediately after the sermon time. And part of the reason for that is that the activities that go on before sermon time. So, for example, with the welcome, we do our best to try and make people feel welcomed, and so we might, sing that song, greet somebody in Jesus' name. Well, for somebody who is neurodiverse, that is tension rising. Somebody who's not necessarily tactile, again, they don't want to go around shaking people's hands, and they don't want to appear to be rude, and so they may just absent themselves until all that activity is over. May leave early because all the greeting that takes place afterwards may make them feel uncomfortable. So it just presents to us a challenge about how we can accommodate those who are neurodivergent. Now, we plan for the majority, but we need to accommodate the minority as well. So we must be proactive in deciding how we will respond to the needs of neurodivergent people in our churches. For example, individuals who are autistic, who practice stimming. Now, stimming is the repetitive performance of certain physical movements, thought processes, or vocalizations. Now, if you have an autistic person who is stimming, how should we as a church react? It's similar to babies crying in church. How do we react? Do we turn and give them a hard stare, or do we just accommodate it? It's just part of the life of the church. For a person who stims, they stim for a reason. They stim for enjoyment, they stim in an attempt to gain sensory input, an attempt to reduce sensory input, to deal with stress and anxiety, to block out uncertainty. So there is a purpose to stimming, and when we try to prevent an autistic person from stimming, we're like putting them in a straitjacket, and it raises tension within them because the very stimming itself, self-stimulatory behaviors, is designed in order to bring them a sense of calm. So we need to be careful how we relate to those who are stimming, and not try to squeeze them into a, in quotes, normal way of behaving in church. As a general rule, stimming should only be limited if it restricts the person's opportunities, causes distress or discomfort, or is in some way unsafe. Here is an example of some, and again, it's not an exhaustive list of different ways that people can stim. Um, And let's face it, this can make people uncomfortable if it's not something that they are used to. But just because it makes us uncomfortable, it doesn't mean that we cannot adapt, we cannot accommodate, um, because it's important for people to be able to calm themselves. Sensory overload. Now, what is that? Sensory overload is such a high state of sensory stimulation or arousal that in order to cope, the brain or nervous system shuts itself down because it has received too much information. Sensory overload can present itself in a variety of forms, including increased blood pressure and heart rate, migraines and headaches, restlessness and discomfort, high levels of stress, fear and anxiety, overly excited stimulation or irritability, language or communication barriers, e.g. speech impairment or lockjaw, higher levels of sensitivity than usual, e.g. textures, sounds, noise, visual stress, flight or fight response, withdrawal or regression. All of these, this sensory overload can have a physical impact on an individual, and lead to what's called a meltdown. Now, a meltdown is an intense response to an overwhelming situation. Oops, that's not very clear at all. It's important for us to make a distinction between tantrums and meltdown. There is some crossover, and the crossover is that middle section there states it's irrational, it lacks skills, it's often misunderstood what is going on, and it's signaling a need. But the difference between the two is that tantrums are controlled, they're purposeful, born out of frustration. The individual who is having the tantrum are aware of what they're doing, and it is communicative. They're trying to manipulate a situation, or maybe they simply don't have the language to articulate what is going on for them, and this is their way of trying to do that. Meltdown is different in that it is dysregulated. It is not controlled. It is not something which the individual decides to do. It is very emotional. It's born out of a sense of being overwhelmed. The individual is unaware of how they're operating when they are melting down, and it's an unresponsive situation. So what we need to do there is to create a state of calm, so that the individual can physically calm down. The adrenaline that is in their system needs to purge, and that can take a little while. But if we react in a confrontational way, or in a punitive way, we can actually make the situation worse. So very important that we think ahead of time. How do we react when autistic people or neurodivergent people act in ways that is outside of what we normally expect? We need to be proactive. So some neuro-friendly tips: acoustics and noise levels. Make sure that our announcements are not too loud, not too quiet. One of the things that we're often told in terms of planning in church is to do not scrimp on your audio visuals, on your sound. Make sure that the sound is of a good quality, not too loud, not too soft. Lighting, make the lighting even. I'm an individual. I don't classify myself as neurodivergent, but I'm an individual that doesn't do well with low lighting. You know, either put the light on or take it off. I like bright light. But we have to have a good balance. Make sure that the lighting doesn't cause issues. Colors, when we're choosing colors, try and choose calm colors, such as sage green, and non-pattern designs that are not confusing or distressing. Bold stripes on the floor, for example, can be mistaken as steps. Textures and furnishing, tactile furnishing that is calming to the touch. In terms of navigation, have good signage up, good wayfinding and directional signage. Decompression spaces, quiet areas for relaxation that are not overstimulating. Temperature, make sure that temperature adjustment is even. Green spaces, sensory equipment, air defenders, fidget spinners, or weighted blankets. All of these things can contribute to helping neurodivergent people, children especially, to be calm in the church environment. Tips for caregivers: be consistent, stick to a schedule, use drawings to communicate where appropriate, reward good behavior. And that's not about telling children that they are good. That can be counterproductive. But you know, when good behavior is rewarded, people want to repeat that good behavior. Use teachable moments. Create a safety zone with visual cues. Pay special attention to sounds, expressions, gestures. Remember that behavior is communication. Even bad behavior is communication, and we need to be emotionally intelligent enough not to react to the behavior, but to ask ourselves the question: what is underpinning that behavior? Make time for fun. You know, fun is one of the best ways to increase those happy hormones, the endorphins that create a feel-good factor. Reduce big jobs into smaller tasks. Keep a safety kit with you in case of accidents. And be consistent. We stated that one already. Repetition is the science of learning. One of the areas that we need to take into account is how the church can support those who care for individuals with disabilities, especially complex disabilities. Because if you are on call 24/7, that is very debilitating. Carers can suffer from stress, burnout, depression, anxiety, PTSD, physical demands, financial problems, can struggle with the unpredictability and the uncertainty of their situation. You know, you never know when an individual is going to need treatment, hospitalization, or emergency actions, when meltdowns are going to happen. It can all lead to a high level of stress. Carers tend to neglect themselves. It's vitally important that carers practice self-care. Guilt, anger, resentment, increased risk of major illness or death. Very high rate of carers who are under high levels of pressure suffer from mental health issues themselves and physical problems themselves. Self-doubt, prolonged or complicated grief, abandoned dreams, lost career opportunities, social isolation and loneliness. All of these are factors that impact carers adversely. And as a church, we can give thought to how we can support those who are carers, because carers tend to operate under the radar. They do what they do in quietness. They're not looking for praise and recognition, but oftentimes we can do something to support, give them a little respite, and that's something that's it's vitally important for carers to build respite into their routines. So even during the course of a day, if it's just an hour for their own care, build that into the day. During the week, building respite time. During the months, respite time, holidays, etc. Because it is a big responsibility, and as a church, we can be proactive in thinking how we can support the carers within our churches. I like this from Plato: be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors, whether it's dealing with challenging behavior, medical emergencies, battles with stigma in society. Special needs families are fighting battles that often go unseen and unappreciated. So we need to give thought to how we can be a support. As we begin to round up, let's look at what inclusion means. There is an enormous difference between being invited and being included. Inclusion means there is a presumed level of competence. People are welcomed as valued members of their community. They fully participate and learn with their peers, and they experience reciprocal social relationships. This is what inclusion is all about. Diane Richler, who past president of Inclusion International, said inclusion is not a strategy to help people fit into systems and structures which exist in our societies. It is about transforming those systems and structures to make it better for everyone. Inclusion is about creating a better world for everyone. And that is our goal within the church. We want to create an environment within our church communities that's better for everybody, including those who are neurodivergent. So in creating an awareness of neurodivergence, what it does is create opportunities for us to make accommodations that promote inclusivity. Education can build bridges to empathy and support. It equips the church to harness the untapped potential for ministry within the pool of unique talents and abilities of many neurodivergent members, and creates a greater awareness. A greater awareness involves recognizing each other's uniqueness in general and the variance within neurodivergence. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 7, the Bible states, "But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not in us." None of us are perfect, but in each one of us, God has placed something special. He has given us particular gifts and talents and abilities, and it is for us to support one another to maximize the potential that He has placed within us, and that includes those within our community who are neurodivergent. Thank you for listening. God bless you.